Imagine this: a girl, no older than 12, wrapped in layers of fine silk and heavy jewels, her face painted to look older than her years. Her hands tremble as she is led into a candlelit chamber where her husband waits a man often twice, even 3 times her age. The chamber is not filled with romance, nor with joy, but with fear. The wedding feast outside is still roaring with laughter, goblets of wine clashing, nobles exchanging smug looks. For them, the union has already served its purpose. An alliance sealed, land exchanged, power secured. But for the girl, the night ahead will change her life forever. This was the reality for countless child brides of the medieval world. Their wedding nights weren't fairy tales of noble knights and beautiful princesses. They were brutal, terrifying, and often deadly. And tonight, we are going to step into that world, peeling back the veils of legend and chivalry to reveal the horrific truth of medieval marriage beds. Before we plunge deeper, I want to welcome you to Past of Medieval. If you've been following our journey through history's darkest and most unsettling corners, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next, because, as you'll soon see, this story only grows darker. Now, you might think of medieval marriage as something sacred, blessed by the church and wrapped in ceremony. And in many ways, it was the church dictated every step of the process: who could marry, at what age, and under what circumstances. But make no mistake, for girls who were thrust into marriages far too young, the sanctity of the church meant very little once the doors of the bridal chamber closed. The law itself paints a chilling picture. In many parts of Europe, the minimum legal age for marriage was shockingly low. Canon Law, system of laws enforced by the Catholic Church, allowed girls to be married at just 12 years old. In some cases, even younger girls were promised to husbands, though the marriage would not be consummated until they reached puberty. Or at least, that was the theory. In practice, the pressure to produce heirs often meant that consummation happened as soon as the vows were spoken, no matter the bride's age. Think about that for a moment. A girl still playing with dolls could suddenly find herself dressed in a wedding gown, handed over to a man she barely knew, and expected to endure the most terrifying night of her short life. This wasn't rare, it was the norm among the nobility. For powerful families, daughters were pawns in a ruthless game of politics. Every marriage was a bargain, a transaction of bloodlines and power. A nobleman might trade his daughter for an alliance with a king. A monarch might marry off his niece to secure loyalty from a rival lord. And once the ceremony was done, the consummation was not only expected, was often witnessed. Yes, you heard that right. In some cases, wedding nights were treated as a public ritual. Nobles might wait outside the bedchamber, sometimes even inspecting the sheets the next morning to prove the girl's virginity had been successfully taken. Imagine the humiliation, the trauma, the complete stripping away of innocence. But here's the most horrific truth. These young brides had no say. They were raised from the cradle to believe their bodies belonged to their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, anyone but themselves. And on their wedding night, their fear was not just of the act itself, but of what might follow: bleeding, infection, or death. Childbirth alone claimed the lives of countless teenage brides in the years that followed. For many, the horrors began that first night and never ended. As we move through this series of stories, we'll uncover real examples of child brides and their tragic fates. We'll look at noble girls who endured unspeakable trauma, at queens who were paraded into marriage beds like sacrificial lambs, and at the church's role in both sanctifying and enforcing these unions. You'll see how the medieval obsession with purity, bloodlines, and heirs turned wedding nights into scenes of horror rather than joy. But before we go further, let me leave you with this thought. When we look at the tapestries, the paintings, and the ballads of medieval weddings, we often see smiling brides, beautiful dresses, and glittering halls. Yet behind those images lay the cries of children forced into adulthood to son cries that history has often silenced. The feast is over. The torches outside are guttering in the wind, and somewhere deep in the castle, a young bride is being led to her chamber. Servants scurry about, preparing the bed with fresh linens that will become a symbol, a witness, a proof. For in the medieval world, a marriage was not truly valid until it was consummated. The girl is nervous. Her hands twist in her lap as she sits, waiting for what comes next. Around her, women of the household whisper, teasing, laughing, sometimes even cruelly reminding her of her duty. She is a child, but she is not treated like one. Her body is no longer her own, it is her husband's possession, her family's bargaining chip, her society's instrument for producing heirs. And then the door opens. The groom enters, often drunk from the endless rounds of wine and ale. Sometimes emboldened by his peers who had slapped him on the back only moments earlier, urging him to prove his manhood. There is no gentle approach, no time for tenderness. For many medieval brides, the wedding night was less about love and more about evidence. The pressure for evidence was immense. In noble households, the consummation was not a private affair at all. In some traditions, members of the family would literally escort the bride and groom to the bed, cheering them on as if it were a public spectacle. In the most humiliating cases, witnesses might wait outside the chamber, ready to inspect the sheets for blood in the morning. That blood, the blood of a girl's torn body, was seen as sacred proof of her virginity, and thus the validity of the union. But what if there was no blood? What if the bride did not bleed? For many girls, this became a nightmare. A bride who failed to prove her purity could be cast aside, disgraced, even accused of deception or witchcraft. Some desperate families even resorted to dark trick-smearing chickens, blood on the sheets to avoid humiliation. The wedding night was not simply a union between two people, it was a performance. And failure came with consequences too terrible to imagine. Now, let's talk about the girls themselves. These were not women in the modern sense of the word. They were children. Their bodies were not developed for the act forced upon them. The pain they endured was beyond what most of us can imagine. Chronic injuries, tearing, infection, these were common. Some brides did not survive their wedding nights at all. Even when they did survive, the trauma followed them for life. Letters from the period occasionally reveal their silent suffering. A 13-year-old noble bride once wrote of being terrified as a lamb taken to slaughter. Others never spoke of it, their silence a reflection of the crushing weight of obedience instilled in them from birth. And what of the husbands? Some were equally young boys forced into manhood too early, but more often, they were men in their 20s, 30s, even 40s. A union between a 12-year-old girl and a 30-year-old lord was seen as perfectly acceptable. To us, it is a horror. To them, it was a contract. Here's the disturbing part. The church didn't just tolerate this, it enforced it. Priests blessed these unions, declaring them holy. The consummation was considered part of God's will, necessary for the continuation of family lines and the stability of kingdoms. Imagine kneeling before a priest, hearing him proclaim that what you are about to endure, something you fear, something that feels like violence, is the divine order. For a child bride, this must have been both bewildering and terrifying. And in some cases, the consummation wasn't merely witnessed, it was orchestrated. There are accounts of noble courts where drunken lords would guard the chamber, singing Bodhi songs and demanding that the groom prove his virility. The bride, trapped in this humiliating circus, had no escape. Her screams were ignored, dismissed as simply the cries of a girl becoming a woman. What makes this even more haunting is the way it was celebrated. In the morning, if blood was shown, the household erupted in joy. Trumpets might sound, bells might ring, feasts might be extended for days. The suffering of a child was turned into entertainment, her pain into a cause for celebration. It was as if the entire society conspired to normalize what, at its core, was a horror. But not every wedding night ended in celebration. Some ended in silence, in shame, or in death. There are chilling accounts of brides who collapsed from bleeding, who could not walk for days afterward, or who fell gravely ill. And still, the cycle continued. Families married off daughters, brides endured, and society looked the other way. This ritual of consummation was, in many ways, the heart of the medieval marriage system. Without it, the union was invalid. With it, the girl's fate was sealed, her life redirected forever, her childhood erased in a single night. And yet, the horror didn't stop there. The wedding night was only the beginning. What followed was often worse. Pregnancies forced upon fragile bodies, endless cycles of childbirth and loss, and the constant shadow of death hanging over every attempt to produce an heir. If the wedding night was terrifying, what followed in the months or, sometimes mere weeks after, was even worse. For medieval child brides, pregnancy was not just a possibility, it was the expectation. The purpose of marriage, in the eyes of both family and church, was to produce heirs. The sooner, the better. But what happens when a child is forced into motherhood before her body is ready? The answer is simple: tragedy. In the Middle Ages, most girls married between the ages of 12 and 16, though noble families often arranged matches even earlier. The moment a girl's first menstrual cycle arrived, she was considered ready for childbearing. To her family, this signaled that she was fertile and therefore a valuable commodity to secure alliances. But menstruation is not the same as maturity. A girl of 12 may be biologically capable of conceiving, but her pelvis is not fully developed, her bones are still growing, and her body is utterly unprepared for the rigors of pregnancy. The results were catastrophic. Childbirth in the medieval period was already one of the leading causes of death for women. For children, the risks were multiplied tenfold. Pelvic deformities, obstructed labor, hemorrhage, infectional, were terrifyingly common. Girls often endured prolonged, agonizing labors that lasted days. Without the surgical interventions available today, many mothers and their babies simply died. One of the most infamous tragedies was that of Margaret Beaufort, the mother of England's future king, Henry VII. She was married at the age of 12 and pregnant by 13. The labor nearly killed her. Historical accounts describe how her small frame was permanently damaged, leaving her unable to bear more children for the rest of her life. Margaret was lucky in the sense that she survived, but she bore the scars of that pregnancy until her death. Her story is not unique. Across Europe, countless girls were forced into early motherhood, with devastating outcomes. Many names are lost to history, but their suffering lingers in whispers letters from priests, chronicles of noble courts, even medical treatises of the time that coldly noted how maidens of tender years oft perish in childbed. But let's look at the cultural expectations that drove this horror. For a noble family, producing heirs was a matter of survival. Land, titles, and wealth all depended on legitimate bloodlines. A girl's womb was seen as a vessel for dynasty. If she could not conceive quickly, she was considered useless. If she failed to bear a son, she risked rejection, humiliation, or even annulment. The pressure was immense. Imagine being 13 years old, your body still fragile, yet being told that your duty or sacred duty is to bear a child. Failure meant disgrace not only for you, but for your entire family. Some brides endured repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths before their 15th birthdays. Their lives became cycles of suffering, conception, pain, loss, and death. Even for those who survived, the toll was brutal. Chronic injuries, such as fistulous tears, caused by obstructed labor left many young brides incontinent and socially ostracized in an era with little medical understanding. These girls were often abandoned, shunned by their husbands, or hidden away in convents to live out their lives in shame. And yet, society celebrated these pregnancies. Royal courts would rejoice when a child bride was declared with child, as if it were a victory. Chroniclers praised the fertility of young brides, ignoring the pain behind their words. The Church framed childbirth as a divine duty, declaring that women were saved through childbearing. But for many of these girls, salvation never came, only suffering. Consider this chilling reality. Some of the most powerful dynasties in Europe were built on the bodies of children who died giving birth. Kings and princes secured their bloodlines by sacrificing the lives of young girls. It was cruelty disguised as tradition, sanctified by religion, and normalized by society. But perhaps the most haunting part is how ordinary it was. Today, we look back in horror. But in the Middle Ages, this was everyday life. Parents celebrated when their 12-year-old daughter became pregnant. Midwives prepared for labors they knew might kill the mother. And husbands, sometimes boys, but often grown men, saw it as their right, their duty, to impregnate their child brides as soon as possible. The human cost was staggering, but it was hidden beneath the grandeur of dynastic politics. We remember the kings and queens, the heirs and rulers, but we forget the hundreds of young girls who never survived their first pregnancies. Their names have been erased, but their silence speaks volumes. And so, for the medieval child bride, the wedding night was not the end of the nightmare, it was only the beginning. What followed was a lifetime of forced pregnancies, endless pain, and the looming shadow of death. But there is another layer to this horror, one that is even more chilling. These young brides were not just expected to bear children. They were also expected to embody the ideals of chastity, obedience, and purity. And when they failed or were merely suspected of failing, the punishments could be as cruel as death itself. If you thought the horrors of medieval child marriage ended with forced wedding nights and dangerous pregnancies, think again. For many brides, the nightmare began even earlier, before the marriage bed, before childbirth, even before the vows. In the Middle Ages, a girl's virginity was not just a personal matter, it was her family's reputation, her husband's honor, and in the case of noble families, the very legitimacy of dynasties. To lose it before marriage or to even appear as though she had was seen as a catastrophic disgrace, and so medieval society developed cruel, humiliating, and often deadly ways to test whether a bride was pure. The most infamous were the so-called virginity tests. These were not medical examinations in any modern sense, but brutal intrusions cloaked in superstition and pseudoscience. A bride might be examined by midwives, priests, or even older female relatives to determine whether her hymen was intact. Of course, this was utterly unreliable. Many girls could have a torn hymen for reasons unrelated to sex, from physical activity to illness. But in medieval minds, this fragile tissue became the deciding factor of a girl's worth. One chilling account comes from medieval France, where noble families often hired women known as matrons to physically inspect the bride before marriage. If she was found lacking, the consequences could be devastating: annulment, public shame, or worse. Imagine the humiliation of a 13-year-old girl, forced to endure a physical examination by strangers while her entire future hung in the balance. But the cruelty didn't stop there. In some cases, virginity tests were public. Yes, public. There are records from parts of medieval Spain and Italy of bridal sheets being displayed after the wedding night, stained with blood as supposed proof of consummation. If the sheet remained unstained, whispers of shame spread through the household. The bride could be accused of impurity, her family disgraced, her marriage annulled. In one particularly cruel case recorded in Florence, a girl, no older than 14, was accused of entering her marriage without honor. Her husband, enraged at the absence of blood, paraded the unstained sheets through the streets as evidence of her supposed corruption. The girl's family tried to defend her, but the scandal destroyed her reputation. She was sent away to a convent, cast aside as if she were a criminal. And this wasn't confined to noble courts. Among peasants, too, virginity was a prized currency. A young bride who failed to prove her chastity could be beaten, abandoned, or forced into humiliating rituals. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was customary for the bride's female relatives to gather outside the bedchamber on the wedding night, listening for signs of consummation. If silence lingered too long, they might even barge in. The pressure on these girls was unimaginable. One night, one chance to secure their family's honor or face ruin. It is important to understand the cruelty of these practices, not just physically, but psychologically. To a child bride, often 12 or 13, the very idea of sex was terrifying. To then be told that her worth as a human being would be judged on the presence of blood on a sheet. That was a burden no child should ever bear. And yet, it was not only expected, it was celebrated. But what if a bride was found or accused of being virginal? The punishments were brutal. Some were quietly sent to convents, effectively erased from society. Others were forced into annulments, shamed as liars or whores. In extreme cases, accusations of lost virginity could lead to violence, even death. Husbands were legally entitled in some regions to punish or even execute wives who were accused of dishonoring the marriage. And let's not forget the dowry system. For noble families, a daughter's virginity was tied directly to money. If she was found impure, her dowry could be withheld, ruining her family financially. In this way, a young girl's body became collateral in a transaction between men. Her suffering was secondary to the fortunes of those around her. Religious authorities reinforced these horrors. The church preached endlessly about the sanctity of chastity, warning girls that losing their virginity before marriage was a sin that could condemn their souls. Priests gave sermons describing virgins as pure vessels of God and condemning fallen women to eternal damnation. For child brides, this meant that their very sense of identity was weaponized against them. To be accused of impurity was not just a social disgrace, but a spiritual death sentence. And perhaps the most terrifying part, these tests and punishments were carried out under the guise of love, honor, and tradition. Families claimed they were protecting their daughters' futures. Husbands claimed they were defending their honor. The church claimed it was saving souls. But in reality, these practices stripped young girls of dignity, safety, and humanity. So, when we imagine a medieval child bride, we must remember that her suffering did not begin on her wedding night. It began with the crushing weight of impossible expectations: to be pure, to be fertile, to be submissive. And if she failed in any one of those roles, the punishments were swift and merciless. But there was another dimension to this tragedy, one even darker than virginity tests or forced pregnancies. These girls were also pawns in political games far beyond their understanding. Some were forced to marry enemies, strangers, or even relatives. Their lives were bartered away in treaties, and their suffering became the price of peace or power. When we hear the words child bride in the Middle Ages, it's easy to imagine the suffering as private, hidden within the walls of a bedchamber or a convent. But for many young girls, their marriages were not simply family matters. They were affairs of state. They were chess pieces moved across the board of Europe, bargaining chips in wars, treaties, and alliances. Their childhoods were sold not for love, not even for family honor, but for power. Consider this. To medieval rulers, a daughter was a tool, a commodity, her body, her fertility. Her womb thieves were weapons, just as potent as armies or fortresses. A marriage contract could secure a peace treaty, expand territory, or unite rival kingdoms. And so, noble and royal girls as young as 6, 7, or 8 were promised in marriage to men they had never met, sometimes men decades older, sometimes even enemies of their own people. Take the tragic story of Isabella of Valois, daughter of King Charles VI of France. At just 6 years old, she was betrothed to England's King Richard II, a man more than 30 years her senior. Imagine a little girl, barely out of the nursery, being paraded before a court of adults as a bride-to-be. For France, this marriage was a way to secure a fragile peace in the endless 100 Years' War. For England, it was a trophy, a way of binding their enemy through a child. For Isabella herself, it was a nightmare she could not even comprehend. At the age of just 7, Isabella became Queen of England. She was dressed in silks, given jewels, and forced to play the role of a wife before she had even learned her letters. Though Richard did not consummate the marriage, immediately, at least according to records, the psychological burden was crushing. She was expected to call him husband, to attend ceremonies as his consort, to serve as a living bond between two nations at war. To those around her, Isabella was not a child. She was a symbol, a pawn, a piece of political property, and Isabella was not alone. Across Europe, dynasties used their daughters to cement power. In Spain, Portugal, Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire child marriages were everywhere. One striking example is that of Joanna of France, who was forced into a marriage with Louis, Duke of when she was just 12. For Louis, the marriage was a curse. He wanted power, not a frail child bride. He treated her cruelly, publicly humiliating her for her small stature and deformities. When he finally became king, he sought to have the marriage and Aletta discarding Joanna like a pawn no longer needed. This was the brutal truth. Child brides were expendable. If they served their political purpose, they might be tolerated. If not, they were cast aside, banished to convents, imprisoned, or replaced with new alliances. But perhaps the most grotesque part of this political machinery was how it stripped children of choice. Imagine being a 13-year-old girl in medieval Spain, betrothed to a man you've never met, whose language you don't speak, in a land you've never seen. You were taken from your home, ripped from your family, and sent across seas or mountains to live among strangers. There are records of child brides sobbing as they were led away, clutching dolls or toys, reminders that they were still children. But to the lords and kings who arranged these marriages, their tears meant nothing. To refuse was unthinkable. Daughters could not rebel against their fathers. Queens could not refuse kings. Marriage was destiny, sealed in ink and blood. In fact, many of these arrangements were made before the girls were even born. Fathers would promise unborn daughters to neighboring rulers in anticipation of future alliances. From the moment of birth, a girl's life might already be mapped out, her husband chosen, her body promised, and the cruelty did not end with the marriage contract. For many child brides, being bound to powerful men meant being dragged into the dangers of politics. If her husband fell from favor, she fell too. If he was murdered, she might be imprisoned or executed alongside him. If he went to war, she became a hostage, a bargaining chip for ransom. The lives of child brides were fragile, not just because of their age, but because they were tied to the volatile currents of power. Consider the case of Margaret of Scotland, married at 11 to the French Dauphin. Louis the Union was meant to strengthen ties between France and Scotland. Instead, Margaret was despised by her husband, who mocked her childishness and humiliated her in court. She died at just 20, worn down by the stress of politics, mocked as useless by the very man she was forced to marry. Her short, tragic life was a reminder that even queens, supposedly the most powerful women of their time, were still pawns in a game they never chose to play. And it wasn't only noble girls. Even among peasants, child marriages were used for alliances, bobit, on a smaller scale. Families might marry off daughters at 12 or 13 to secure land, settle debts, or unite with more prosperous neighbors. Though the stage was smaller, the stakes were just as high. For the girl, it meant a life of labor, childbirth, and obedience. For the family, it was a transaction, a daughter sold to improve fortunes, so whether princess or peasant, the fate of a child bride was rarely her own. Her life was dictated by fathers, husbands, priests, and kings. Her body was a tool of diplomacy, her suffering a footnote in chronicles of power. And yet, there is a cruel irony here. While these marriages were meant to secure peace and stability, they often did the opposite. Forced unions bred resentment, rebellion, and even war. Girls too young to bear children often died in childbirth, leaving dynasties without heirs. Alliances collapsed, treaties failed, and bloodshed resumed. The very system that sought to control power often undermined it. So when we look back at medieval child brides, we must see them not as queens in gowns or figures in paintings, but as victims of a ruthless system that treated children as bargaining chips in a violent game of power. But the political dimension of child marriage was only one piece of the nightmare. There was another, perhaps even darker consequence, the devastating toll on their health, forced pregnancies, dangerous childbirths, and lifelong suffering that began before their bodies were ready. When we think of childbirth today, it is still a dangerous ordeal in many parts of the world. But in the Middle Ages, it was a gamble with death for even the healthiest, most fully grown women. Now imagine the added horror when the bride was not a woman at all, but a child, her body far too small, her bones too narrow, her strength too fragile to survive the ordeal of pregnancy and labor. For these girls, marriage was not just the loss of innocence, it was often a death sentence. Let's begin with the brutal reality of biology. A girl of 12 or 13, though technically capable of conceiving, was still in the middle of her own development. Her hips had not yet fully widened, her pelvis not yet prepared for the passage of a child. Her body was still growing, competing for nutrition and strength with the fetus inside her. This meant pregnancy was not only excruciating, but also often deadly, leading to obstructed labor, internal injuries, or death in childbirth. One medieval physician bluntly described the problem. A girl too young to give birth is like a tree branch too thin to hold fruit. Both will break. The annals of history are filled with tragic examples. Consider Margaret Beaufort, the mother of England's King Henry VII. She was married at 12 and pregnant soon after. Her body was so small, so unready for childbirth, that she nearly died delivering her son at the age of just 13. Though she miraculously survived, her reproductive organs were damaged beyond repair. Margaret never bore another child. She lived the rest of her life with chronic pain, her body broken before she was even a woman. Her story is one of survival, but also of warning. She was one of the lucky ones. Most girls forced into pregnancies so young did not survive. Medieval chronicles, though often written by men, sometimes left chilling hints of these tragedies. There are records of noble brides perishing in their first labors, or dying in childbed ere their 14th year. For common girls, such deaths were even more frequent, though rarely recorded. Families often accepted it as fate, or even as part of God's will. Childbirth, after all, was seen as both a holy duty and a divine trial. If a girl died, it was said to be the Lord's judgment. But behind this cold acceptance was a trail of grief, blood, and wasted lives. And the suffering was not limited to death itself. Many young brides endured obstetric fistulas, horrific injuries caused when prolonged obstructed labor tore holes between the birth canal and the bladder or rectum. Girls who survived these injuries were often left incontinent, shunned by their husbands, abandoned by families, and condemned to a life of isolation. Others endured repeated pregnancies, their bodies weakening with each attempt. By their mid-teens, some girls had already given birth multiple times. their youth consumed by a cycle of pregnancy, labor, and mourning. Infants often died, and mothers followed soon after. The medieval world had few remedies. Physicians offered herbs, charms, or prayers, but these did little against the reality of a pelvis too small to bear life. Priests told girls to pray, to trust in God's mercy. But mercy was rare in the medieval birthing chamber. And yet, despite the horrors, society celebrated fertility. A girl who bore children, even at 13 or 14, was praised as a good wife, a fruitful bride. Her suffering was dismissed as necessary, her survival seen as proof of divine favor. In royal courts, childbirth was even a public spectacle, with witnesses ensuring no trickery or deceit about the heir's legitimacy. Imagine the cruelty: a terrified child forced into labor, surrounded by strangers watching her agony, her screams echoing as her body tore apart. For those who survived, their lives were often brief. The constant strain of early motherhood, combined with malnutrition and lack of medical care, shortened their lifespans drastically. Many did not live to see 30. Their bodies bore the scars of repeated trauma, and their spirits often bore the weight of grief for lost children. But perhaps most horrifying of all is how normalized this suffering was. Medieval society did not see it as tragic, at least not in the way we might. It was expected. A girl was born to marry. She was married to breed. If she died in the process, she had fulfilled her duty. This chilling normalization stripped away the humanity of countless young brides. Their lives, their pain, their deaths were footnotes in chronicles of kings and battles, if they were remembered at all. And yet, in some rare cases, the stories of these girls pierced through the silence. The haunting tale of Isabella of France, sent as a child bride to England, or Margaret Beaufort's near-death experience at 13. Remain reminders of the devastating reality behind the political marriages and gilded crowns. Behind every alliance, every treaty, every queen in a history book, there was often a girl, a child, screaming in agony, fighting for her life in a bed soaked with blood. So, while the politics of child marriage turned these girls into pawns, the biology of childbirth made them martyrs. Their bodies became battlegrounds for dynasties, their deaths the hidden cost of medieval power. But beyond the physical torment lay something perhaps even more insidious: the psychological toll, to be married off as a child, to be raped under the guise of duty, to endure pregnancies, and deaths at such a young age. What did this do to the minds of these girls? How did they cope? Or did they even have the chance to cope at all? If the physical suffering of medieval child brides was horrific, the psychological torment was equally devastating, though far harder to trace in the written records. Medieval chroniclers were quick to note battles, kings, and scandals, but the inner lives of girls were rarely recorded. Their voices were silenced by a world that didn't care to hear them. Yet, between the lines of history and the whispers of chronicles and the fragments of letters, we can still glimpse the immense emotional weight these children carried. Imagine being 12 years old, still clinging to dolls or playing games with other children, when suddenly you are told, you are now a wife. Tonight, you must share a bed with a grown man. For many, that man was not just older, sometimes decades older, but also a stranger, chosen purely for political gain. The fear must have been overwhelming. Historians have described the wedding night terror experienced by these young girls. Some fainted, some cried uncontrollably, some had to be physically forced into the marital bed, and yet, their resistance was framed as childish tantrums or even sinful disobedience. Worse still, the very people meant to protect them, parents, priests, and guardians, were the ones orchestrating their fate. The betrayal was absolute. To a child bride, the world must have felt like a prison with no escape. For some girls, the trauma showed itself in silence. Chroniclers note that certain young brides became withdrawn, refusing to speak or eat after their weddings. Others developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of depression, described at the time as melancholia. In an age when mental health was poorly understood, such suffering was often dismissed as weakness or even demonic influence. There are accounts of queens and noblewomen who, after being married off too young, spent their lives in prayer or seclusion, turning to religion not out of choice, but as a desperate refuge from unbearable trauma. Cloistered in convents, they found in silence and ritual the only escape available to them. But not all child brides endured passively. In rare and remarkable cases, resistance did occur. One striking example is Joan of France, married off as a child to Louis, Duke of Chu, was deeply unhappy in her marriage, rejected by her husband, and later annulled when he became king. Rather than wallow in humiliation, Joan turned her pain into piety. She founded a religious order, carving out a legacy of her own making. While she did not resist her marriage outright such, defiance was nearly impossible. She refused to let it define her entirely. Another example is Isabella of France, sent as a young bride to England to marry Edward II, though only a teenager when she became queen. Isabella would later rise against her husband, lead a rebellion, and seize power in her own right. Historians often debate her motives, but it's clear that her early marriage, filled with neglect and humiliation, planted the seeds of her eventual revolt. Even more telling are the scattered stories of unknown girls who tried to flee. Records exist of brides attempting to escape their new husbands, some running back to their families, others vanishing into convents. Most were caught and punished, but their attempts speak to a universal truth. Even in a world that saw them as pawns, some girls refused to surrender quietly. Yet resistance was the exception, not the rule. For most child brides, there was no escape. The church, the law, and family honor were all stacked against them. Even if a girl voiced her despair, there was no sympathetic ear. To her husband, she was property. To her family, she was an asset. To the church, she was a vessel for children. Her suffering was invisible, even when it was written across her face. And perhaps that is the greatest cruelty of all. Not just that these children were abused, but that their pain was erased. The silence of history on this matter is deafening. How many cried themselves to sleep night after night? How many prayed for death to free them? How many carried lifelong trauma, their inner worlds shattered before they were even women? We will never know their names. We will never read their words. But their suffering lingers in the shadows of medieval history. Hidden beneath the gilded illusions of royal weddings and dynastic alliances, and yet the question remains, why did medieval society allow this horror to continue? Why were children sacrificed in this way, generation after generation, without outrage or reform? Behind every child bride's tears, every silent scream on her wedding night, there stood a powerful machine, the machinery of dynastic ambition. To fully understand why these horrors continued, we must step back and examine the system that treated children not as human beings, but as currency. In the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely about love. It was about land, titles, alliances, and power. For kings, nobles, and even wealthy merchants, daughters were not daughters at all, they were bargaining chips. A girl's worth was measured in what she could bring her family politically, not in her happiness, her safety, or her life. A royal marriage could secure peace between rival kingdoms, merge to powerful dynasties, or bring in vast estates and wealth. In such calculations, the age of the bride mattered little. In fact, the younger she was, the more valuable she became. A child bride was pliable, easily molded, and her fertility promised decades of potential heirs. To medieval rulers, this made her the ultimate investment. We often imagine the grand medieval wedding as a pageant of beauty, church bells ringing, processions of richly dressed nobles, glittering banquets. But beneath the spectacle lay a disturbing truth. These celebrations were often nothing more than disguised transactions. The bride was paraded like an object, her innocence turned into a public display of her family's triumph. The church played a deeply contradictory role in this system. On the one hand, it preached chastity, purity, and the sanctity of marriage. On the other, it sanctioned the unions of children, sometimes as young as 7, declaring them valid so long as vows were exchanged. Theologians argued endlessly about the age of consent, but in practice, political expedience always won. Bishops and popes themselves arranged and blessed these marriages, even when they involved children barely out of infancy. The hypocrisy was staggering. Priests condemned ordinary peasants for sins of the flesh, while turning a blind eye or even giving their blessing to aristocrats, forcing children into beds they were too small to even climb into. And yet, perhaps most shocking of all, is that everyone knew these marriages were not hidden. They were public, celebrated, recorded in chronicles, immortalized in art. The suffering of the child was invisible, not because it was secret, but because no one cared. Medieval society had so thoroughly normalized the sacrifice of children for dynastic power that their pains simply did not matter. From France to England, from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, the pattern repeated endlessly. 12-year-old brides to 40-year-old kings, 9-year-old princesses married off to foreign princes. 14-year-olds pregnant, with heirs before their bones had finished growing. The victims were countless, their names scattered like ashes through the pages of history. And what of the children themselves? They rarely found a place in the chronicles. Kings were remembered for their conquests, queens for their crowns, but the brides who died young, in childbirth or in obscurity, vanished from memory. Their lives were consumed by a system that saw them as expendable. Every time a child bride cried, every time she bled on her wedding night, every time she withered in childbirth, it was a direct consequence of this ruthless logic of power. To the great dynasties, her life was a small price to pay for land, for peace, for thrones. But let us not allow them to remain invisible. As we uncover these stories today, we breathe life back into the forgotten. We remember that behind the gilded veils and coronation robes were children robbed of their childhood. We acknowledge the horror that history often sought to gloss over with pretty ceremonies and noble titles. And perhaps most importantly, we recognize that their suffering was not inevitable. It was not fate, nor divine will. It was a choice, made again and again by those in power. A choice to sacrifice innocence on the altar of ambition. And so, when we speak of medieval history, let us remember not just the kings and queens, but the child brides whose lives were broken in silence. Let us remember that every empire, every dynasty, every royal bloodline came at a terrible cost paid in the suffering of the youngest and most vulnerable. If you found this story as haunting as I did, and you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be remembered, consider supporting this channel by subscribing and sharing this video. The more we uncover these darker truths, the less likely history is to repeat them, because history is not just about battles and crowns, it's about the human lives, especially the most fragile ones, sacrificed along the way.